World War II, the war that would see the liberation of Europe from the armies of Adolf Hitler. Well, in fact, nearly 400,000 Americans gave their lives in World War II, only to find the real victor was in fact the greatest mass murderer of all, Joseph Stalin, the butcher of the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, a great transformation had taken place. Nations that were liberated from the German occupation were then turned over, many of them, to the communist orbit. Czechoslovakia, Poland, and many other countries, including Albania, not to mention the Baltic states, all transferred to the heels of the brutal communist dictator Joseph Stalin. And that was just the beginning. With the enslavement of Europe under communism and the loss of more millions of lives, such tyranny was then extended to parts of Africa, the Middle East, and indeed Asia, culminating in the betrayal of Korea to Stalin, North Korea, and then the greatest prize of all, Communist China, a nation that had been free until Mao Zedong and his gang came to power in 1949. What you are about to see, ladies and gentlemen, is going to shock you, it's going to anger you, and indeed, hopefully, it will prod you to do a greater research into the annals of America's betrayal during World War II. Stay tuned. The documentary which you are about to see is indeed dedicated to the memory of the late Dan Smoot, who created the Dan Smoot Report. Dan Smoot had been an FBI agent for a long time and then left the Bureau to begin his own educational campaign, seeing the dangers of internationalism and interventionism into foreign affairs, the abandonment, if you will, of America's foreign policy as enunciated by our President, George Washington, in his farewell address, to beware of foreign entanglements, to beware of wars, particularly at home in Europe, not to become personally involved in any way, shape, or form, for they knew the end result could only make matters worse.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. President Roosevelt campaigning again on a platform of no war in Europe. And as Professor Dan Smoot says, before Pearl Harbor, the American people were almost solidly opposed to our interventionism in yet another European war. Remember, it's very important to understand, as we'll show you in the next few minutes, that America was, quote, isolationist, unquote, because America had already lost 250,000 of her men in arms in World War I. The war incidentally, that was dubbed the war to end all wars. Well, America wasn't buying it in the 1930s. Americans knew instinctively that we had failed in the First World War to bring about those so-called goals, and we weren't about to do it again. So obviously, it would take a dramatic event to catapult the nation's psyche for war. But as Professor Smoot says, in the campaign of 1940, Roosevelt, running for a third term, made political capital of public sentiment in opposition to war in Europe. Again and again, Roosevelt told the people how he hated war, and Eleanor hated war, and indeed his whole family hated war, while doing everything he could behind the scenes to get America catapulted into that war. Well, indeed, that's exactly what he was doing. Yet Germany's acceptance of America's violations of neutrality was a surprising feature of the European War. Between June of 1940 and December of 1941, American military interventionism in Europe in World War I had proved decisive, and the Germans obviously were not courting a repeat with World War II. While trying to goad Germany into open hostilities against America, Roosevelt was also putting pressure on Japan. One of the first things he did was to station the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii in April of 1940. Admiral J.O. Richardson, then Commander-in-Chief of the fleet, protested, saying the fleet should be kept on the west coast of the United States. And he gave several reasons. One of them was the ships were inadequately manned for war. Another was that the Hawaiian area was too exposed for fleet training during the existing international tensions. And finally, the fleet defenses against air and submarine attacks were far below the required standards of strength. Well, FDR, Roosevelt, further weakened the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in March of 1941 when he detached 3 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 4 light cruisers, and 18 destroyers for duty in the Atlantic. Yet he kept insisting that the fleet was out there to deter Japanese aggression. Well, to Navy men who knew it, it was apparent that Roosevelt had moved the fleet from the West Coast, stationed it with inadequate defenses at Pearl Harbor, and depleted its strength, not to halt the Japanese, but rather to invite an attack. Admiral Richardson's strong complaints cost him the command of the Pacific Fleet in January of 1941. And Admiral Kimmel, Husband Kimmel, was the man who would replace him. As we now know, those who study history are condemned to repeat it. Admiral Kimmel and General Short were the 2 men at Pearl Harbor upon whose shoulders the burden for the so-called sneak attack at Pearl Harbor would be laid. And yet both of them were kept totally in the dark by the Roosevelt administration. Not everyone was entranced, however, with the idea that America should get involved in yet another worldwide conflict, particularly in European war. Charles Lindbergh of the America First Committee stood firm in his opposition to involvement in that war. And he was joined by many Americans, including former President Hoover in August of 1941, issuing a statement which said, quote, "The American people should insistently demand that Congress put a stop to step-by-step projection of the United States into undeclared war. It is not purely a world conflict between tyranny and freedom. Insofar as this is a war of power politics, the American people want no part of. Few people honestly believe that the Axis is now or will in the future be in a position to threaten the independence of any part of this hemisphere if our defenses are properly maintained. Freedom in America does not depend on the outcome of struggles for material power between other nations." And then Hiram Johnson, at the time, trumpeted in the United States Senate a question which never has been answered, ladies and gentlemen, even to this date. He said, quote, "Good God, did we ever sink so low before as to choose one cutthroat out of two? This man Stalin was Hitler's ally. Now we furnish him with weapons with which he turns upon us."
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
But in order to understand why America was deceived once again, and why her leaders in Washington, and yes, indeed, in Great Britain, Winston Churchill, were secretly plotting to get America into this war, we really should take a refresher course and go back in history to the First World War. Again, the Great War, as it was called, the war to end all wars. Let's take a look at how America was deceived in that war as well. In his book, The Pity of War, explaining World War I, Neil Ferguson of Jesus College at Oxford University paints a rather striking picture of the war. Very precisely, he says, Germany found herself in an interesting if precarious position around 1912. She had few allies that mattered militarily. Germany's reliance on the tottering Habsburg Empire on the Eastern Front was disappointing and caused her general staff much worry. What is more, Germany was in a relatively worse position in nearly every area concerning national strength versus the British Empire, and France as well, contrary to the ordinary historical viewpoint that suggested a growing Germany was somehow threatening a stagnating or declining Britain. This, one must say, is the very thesis and centerpiece of his work. Germany struck first precisely due to her weakness, not as many historians have claimed due to her rising strength. That bias up until current times has accounted for the idea that Britain was a victim, and France as well, defending themselves against German aggression. In fact, just the contrary was true. Now in America, President Woodrow Wilson, campaigning for re-election in 1916, had unequivocally supported our national foreign policy. Wilson's one major promise to the American people was that he would keep them out of a European war. Yet even while making this promise, Wilson was yielding to a pressure he was never able to withstand: the powerful influence of a man named Colonel Edward Mandell House, his all-powerful advisor. According to House's own papers and the historical studies of Wilson's ardent admirers, for example, Intimate Papers of Colonel House, edited by Charles Seymour, published in 1926 by Houghton Mifflin, and The Crisis of the Old Order, House created Wilson's domestic and foreign policy, selected most of Wilson's cabinet and other major appointees, and then even ran the State Department. House had powerful connections with international bankers in New York. And as we have seen in the work of Professor Anthony Sutton of the Hoover Institution, in his monumental work, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and his work, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, there's no question that powerful international banking families in Europe and New York were propelling America into European adventurism. Well, Edward Mandell House was influential with great financial institutions, those such as the Warburg family, the Kahn family, the Marburg family, Henry Morgenthau, Jacob and Mortimer Schiff, the Lehman families, all international banking institutions. Well, bringing all these forces to bear, House persuaded Wilson that America had an evangelical mission to save the world for democracy and to make the post-war world secure from war by organizing some sort of world federation. America would be catapulted into war. Wilson appointed a committee of intellectuals to draw up the League of Nations scheme. Failing to involve America in this league, House founded the Council on Foreign Relations, which was incorporated in the United States in 1921 and which the Rockefeller family started financing in 1927. So now we see, ladies and gentlemen, how Woodrow Wilson declared war with Congress in 1917 on Germany. After World War I, the situation in Europe was a total and complete failure. The war essentially solved nothing but created more problems. Indeed, problems that would have to be addressed inevitably by seeing another world war. Though we were promised that World War I would be the war to end all wars, the Great War, peace in our time, democracy, all of these ideas that would be sold to the American public, a war-weary public. Indeed, 20 million people were killed during World War I. 250,000 of them were American men, the doughboys as they called them. Well, after World War I and the failure to establish a League of Nations as envisioned by Mr. Edward Mandell House of the Council on Foreign Relations, the stage was being set for yet another world war, unavoidable, though just the opposite was being claimed after World War I. Something interesting happened. Russia, now firmly in the grip of the Bolshevik communist butchers, was in a firm position to wait it out and see exactly the timing of Germany and the rest of Europe unfold as the next war would undoubtedly come about within a few short years. During the reign of the Bolsheviks in Russia, literally millions were killed. Joe Stalin himself, the infamous Jesse James of the Urals, was indeed, up till that point, the greatest mass murderer in history. In the Bolshevik Soviet Union, there was a climate of hatred, class struggle, warfare, and liquidation as had never before been seen in modern history. Now, what made all of this possible? What made it possible for Russia, under the Bolsheviks, to continue its slaughter through the 1920s and right through the 30s, indeed, right through to World War II? Well, the New York Times, for one. The New York Times had sent a reporter, Walter Duranty, to Russia to paint a rosy picture, believe it or not. Incredible as it may sound, that's exactly what happened. The publishers and editors of the New York Times sent Walter Duranty, who later would win a Pulitzer Prize for essentially covering up the crimes of Joe Stalin and admitting that he had not seen any of the crimes which had been laid at the doorstep of Stalin. Now, that's an incredible feat when you think about it. Yet the New York Times actually perpetrated this major hoax on the American public, later to be revealed as such. It's interesting because when FDR became president in 1932, one of the first official duties of the Roosevelt administration in 1933 was to do something that had been virtually unheard of in American history, and that was to declare and establish diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Empire. Now, many of you probably don't know exactly the implications of such a policy. Previous presidents, even President Wilson, could not possibly embrace the idea that the United States should extend diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. Why? Because what it meant was it would open the door to aid and trade and economic support for a regime that had already murdered millions of its own. So the Roosevelt administration did exactly that. Under the guidance and tutelage of this Council on Foreign Relations, FDR proceeded to extend total diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, which meant the Soviet Union was saved from imminent collapse. Indeed, communism always bankrupts a nation and cannot sustain itself economically. So it was the United States government and the Roosevelt administration which was responsible for saving the Soviet Union from collapse. This is important because what you are going to see in this documentary will show conclusively that there indeed was a long-term plan to save communism from collapse, to nurture communism and the Soviet Empire, and then ultimately to reward the Soviet Union with constant aggression, constant opportunities for land grab, and indeed to extend its tentacles all the way across the world. It could not have happened without American complicity and support. Now, at the same time that the Roosevelt administration had come into office in 1933 effectively, something interesting was happening in Germany. Adolf Hitler would come to power. Now, the interesting thing is that Germany, after World War I, had been, at the Treaty of Versailles, given the most onerous position of any nation possible. Having lost the war to American interventionism, Germany had been saddled with enormous debt that could not be paid back. Some $30 billion was to be paid in war reparations. That in itself put a tremendous burden on the German taxpayers and virtually ensured another world war. Now, Hitler came to power at the same time that Roosevelt came to power in America. Remember, Joe Stalin had just been rewarded with the diplomatic recognition. And Joe Stalin's regime in Russia obviously would stand the greatest opportunity to benefit from yet another world war with American interventionism on her behalf.
Eine solche Bewegung aus nichts geschaffen worden. Sie können uns unterdrücken, sie können uns meinetwegen töten, kapitulieren werden wir nicht. Menschen geknebelt und geschlagen, den Gummitnippel zum Zepter ihrer Freiheit erhoben, Deutschland nach außen versklavt und jetzt in letzter Minute, seit 6 Wochen, da entdecken sie auf einmal, dass es auch so etwas wie Freiheit geben soll. Ich weiß, dass sie nun diese Bewegung, die heute dieses Recht für sich in Anspruch nimmt, hassen. Ich weiß auch, dass sie uns mit schweren Vorwürfen beladen. Ihr habt vielleicht geglaubt, uns mit diesem blutigen Terror mürbe zu machen. Ich versichere euch, ehe noch 2 oder 3 Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror beseitigt sein. So wahr wir das von alter
Well, as you can see, Hitler indeed had enormous potential in Germany. And indeed, none other than Winston Churchill himself heaped tremendous praise on Hitler for the remarkable recovery that Germany made. Remember, at this particular time, in the early 1930s, Germany, like the United States, had been thrust into a depression, a very serious depression. Indeed, after World War I, with the enormous debt and the enormous inflation of the currency that had to take place because of impositions on Germany, the value of the mark had dropped so dramatically that women were coming to pick up their husbands' paychecks at their factories twice a day, because in a matter of hours, the currency would lose value, literally carting wheelbarrows full of German marks to the banks. Now, in America, Roosevelt, as president, had done everything he could to try to instigate a war in Europe. Indeed, Roosevelt's Secret War is a book that was recently published and authored by Mr. Persico. In this book, it shows how Roosevelt and Churchill were both transmitting secret codes and secret messages to each other to try to find a way for America once again to enter into a European war. Mind you, we had already been told World War I would be the war to end all wars. Looking back in hindsight now, you can clearly see the invisible hand, as Professor Dan Smoot called it, the Council on Foreign Relations here in America and similar organizations in Europe. Once again, you can see the heavy hand of the international banking companies and those families who not only helped bankroll Hitler into power in Germany, but also established the Bolshevik Empire in 1917. So now you have three factors here. You have Soviet Russia surviving Lenin, going into a period under Joe Stalin in which the most vile murders took place under Stalin. The Ukrainians lost some 10 million people to mass starvation. Yet, as we had referred to earlier, the New York Times had sent a reporter, Walter Durante, there, and he said that he could not find any evidence of such genocide. He was rewarded later with a Pulitzer Prize for journalistic plateaus. Well, Soviet Russia, on the one hand, now saved officially by the Roosevelt administration under the control of the Council on Foreign Relations in 1933 by extending diplomatic recognition. Hitler in power in Germany, and Hitler and his government working, obviously, to establish an empire, a 1,000-year reign, if you will, over Europe. But Hitler's government, Nazi government, was in fact a National Socialist government. It was a government which, interestingly enough, like Roosevelt's government, was promoting heavy government control of industry, fascism. And ironically, President Roosevelt adopted almost exactly the same economic formula as had been implemented by Mussolini in Italy and indeed Germany during the Nazi Revolution. Not everyone was to be deceived by this drumbeat toward war under the Roosevelt campaign, along with Winston Churchill, to drag America into yet another world conflict. Charlie Lindbergh of the America First Committee spoke valiantly and courageously against American involvement in yet another world war that would result in greater tragedy than before. None other than former President Herbert Hoover, in 1941, August, issued a public statement, along with others, that said the American people should insistently demand that Congress put a stop to step-by-step projection of the United States into undeclared war. It is not purely a world conflict between tyranny and freedom. Insofar as this is a war of power politics, the American people want no part of. Few people honestly believe that the Axis is now or will in the future be in a position to threaten the independence of any part of this hemisphere if our defenses are properly prepared. Freedom in America does not depend on the outcome of struggles for material power between other nations. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, what we have had here is a deliberate pattern of attempting to use fear as an instrumentality of getting the American people psyched up for war. Roosevelt did this not only professionally and efficaciously, but he did it with an incredible vigor, to use a word from the vocabulary of John F. Kennedy. The costly and ridiculous and useless Roosevelt-Churchill meeting aboard warships in August of 1941, when the Atlantic Charter was fabricated, was a Roosevelt propaganda production to capture the imagination of Americans and make them think the European war was a holy crusade which America had an obligation to enter. Professor Dan Smoot once again observes, Americans wanted no more bloody crusades. They felt that American neutrality should be preserved. Seeing the results of World War I and 250,000 American men dead as a result of that conflict, with absolutely no resolution to the wars and crises that caused those wars on the European continent in sight. In fact, as we have shown, just the opposite was true. The stage would be set for yet another world war because of the Treaty of Versailles. Roosevelt, in using the psychology of fear, says Dan Smoot, to get the people to do what the government wanted, something radically new in America, Roosevelt used successfully a special technique, the public committee technique. Roosevelt inspired what was known as the White Committee, popularly known as the Committee to Save America by Helping the Allies. Under the chairmanship of William Allen White, scores of distinguished Americans were associated with the committee, its mission to frighten the American public into war, to convince them that America was doomed if we did not help our friends defeat Hitler. Because if we did not help, Hitler would surely conquer all and then come after us. This public committee technique, as it was called, had become the government's classic means of applying fear psychology to get the public support for whatever government leaders wanted. Senator Hiram Johnson's fearful prediction was accurate as well. He said the aid that we give the Soviets would be turned against us. And surely that fact was in evidence.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
As we said earlier in this documentary, the Council on Foreign Relations would be incorporated in 1921. The major purpose of the Council under Edward Mandell House would be for a, quote, positive foreign policy for America, one of interventionism and internationalism, the exact opposite of what the Founding Fathers of America had intended. And of course, in order to do that, we had to have fear established as a mechanism of control. Yes, the Roosevelt administration repeatedly tried to frighten the American public into war with Germany. That wasn't working. In fact, Germany wanted nothing to do with a repeat of World War I, where American entry into the war had proved decisive, and the Germans lost. The last thing the Germans wanted was to attack America or American installations. Now, it is true that German U-boats had indeed penetrated the Americas, and that was primarily because America was also penetrating Europe and doing everything it could to instigate an attack on American installations in the Atlantic. When that didn't work, all hell would break loose.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
It was obvious in Washington that a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would come simultaneously with the final breakdown of diplomatic negotiations between Japan and the United States. On November 26, 1941, Cordell Hull, who was American Secretary of State, handed the Japanese ambassadors in Washington an ultimatum, which Hull himself said meant war. Hull told the Secretaries of the Army and Navy that Japanese relations were now in their hands, that diplomacy had gone as far as it could go. Now, on November 25, 1941, knowing that an ultimatum was going to be given to Japan the next day, and realizing that nothing but war would result from it, Roosevelt called a meeting of his top advisors, among them Henry Stimson, Secretary of War. And Mr. Stimson, in his testimony as to what happened at that meeting, reads as follows. Mr. Hull said that the Japanese were poised for the attack, that they might attack at any time. The President said the Japanese were notorious for making an attack without warning, and stated that we might be attacked, say, next Monday, for example. Stimson's diary for November 25th stated the problem succinctly. The question, and this is verbatim, the question was how we could maneuver the Japanese into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. None of this information was allowed to be given to our commanders in Hawaii. On the afternoon of Saturday, December 6th, 1941, a 14-part message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington started coming in. American monitors were receiving it and deciphering it as it was delivered. The message advised Japanese ambassadors in Washington that the 14th part of this message would not be transmitted from Tokyo until that fateful Sunday morning, December 7th, and that it should not be delivered to the American government until exactly 1 p.m. Washington time on Sunday. This obviously meant that the Japanese were planning a strike against American territory at 1 p.m. Washington time on Sunday, December 7th of 1941. Now that happens to be 7 a.m. Honolulu time. The first 13 parts of this Japanese secret message were received, deciphered, and distributed among American officials by 9 p.m. Saturday, December 6th. A Washington officialdom knew that war was coming to the United States on the very next day. Now, a fear that had been perpetrated on the American public through the media by the Roosevelt administration was that a Nazi end run through South America and therefore into the United States had long been the goal of the Axis powers. Well, where did this come from, this notion of a impending conspiratorial attack on the United States by Germany and the Axis powers? Well, in his book, Roosevelt's Secret War, FDR and World War II Espionage by Joseph E. Persico, we're told the British had long been feeding FDR's fears. An MI6 report forwarded to the president nearly a year and a half before warned him that German troops were headed for Dakar, Senegal, just 1,900 miles across the South Atlantic from Natal, Brazil. These troops, the British claimed, were the vanguard of a far larger force that would cross this narrow neck of the ocean and set up bases in Brazil within striking distance of the Panama Canal. Well, the British report had 6,000 German troops already there, prepared to join pro-Nazi Brazilians to overthrow the pro-American regime of President Getulio Vargas. FDR ordered the Navy to come up with a plan to thwart this purported takeover. The American press was instantly suspicious of the map that FDR had described in his Navy Day speech. At a press conference the next day, a reporter asked Roosevelt if he might see the map. "Oh, he could not do that," the president explained in horror. "It has on it certain manuscript notations, which, if they were reproduced, would in all probability disclose where the map came from." And disclosure, of course, would dry up the source of future information. Another reporter asked, "What would you say to the charge of suspicion of the map?" Well, FDR smiled complacently, and he said that he had acquired the map from a source which is undoubtedly reliable. There's no question about that. Now, here's the important point, ladies and gentlemen. Not only was the map spurious, but the purported Nazi plot to take over Bolivia that FDR had warned of in his earlier fireside chat was an outright British fabrication, according to Mr. Persico's research in this book, Roosevelt's Secret War. The letter from the Bolivian attaché alleging the plot had been forged by the BSC and swallowed whole at the White House, even before Secretary of State Cordell Hull had the British intelligence agents manufacturing documents detailing Nazi conspiracies in South America. The intriguing question, he says, is why all of this suspect intelligence? Reports of Nazi troops in South America, a forged letter predicting a Nazi takeover in Bolivia, a suspicious map, a manipulated version of various and sundry incidents that were taking place with German U-boats. Why all of this? Well, clearly the answer is he wanted to drag America into war. And the British were feeding the American government fabricated stories of alleged Nazi penetration of America's hemisphere.
War is the law of the jungle. Kill or be killed. There are no half measures, no alibi runs. You've got to twist your instincts inside out to play this game, because it's played to win anyway. The goal is destruction, pure and simple. Your mind must be tuned to a new pitch, to go after your enemy all out. No holds barred, to hurt, to cripple, to kill. This is war. A battle not for a pot of gold or an invitation to the Rose Bowl, but for survival.
So America would be propelled into the war finally because of the Roosevelt orchestration of events at Pearl Harbor. The treachery of World War II can now be understood in its proper context. We know that FDR and his military advisors in November of 1943 had already agreed that America should take and occupy Berlin. Yet 17 months later, the United States did exactly the opposite. In the closing days of World War II, the American Ninth Army was rolling toward Berlin, meeting little resistance, slowed down only by German civilians clogging the highways, fleeing from the Soviets. German sound trucks were circulating in the Berlin area, counseling stray troops to stop resistance and surrender to the Americans. Some 20 or 30 miles east of Berlin, the German nation had concentrated its dying strength and was fighting strongly against the Soviet army. Our Ninth Army could have been in Berlin within a few hours, probably without shedding another drop of blood. But General Eisenhower suddenly halted our army. He kept it sitting idly outside Berlin for 10 days while the Soviets slugged their way in, killing, raping, and ravaging. The United States gave the Soviets control of the eastern portion of Berlin and all the territory surrounding the city. To the south, General Patton's forces were plowing into Czechoslovakia. When Patton was just 30 miles from Prague, the capital, Eisenhower ordered him to stop, ordered him not to accept the surrender of German soldiers, but to hold them at bay until the Soviets could move up and accept surrender. As soon as the Soviets were thus established as the conquerors of Czechoslovakia, Eisenhower ordered Patton to evacuate. Units of Czechoslovakian patriots had been fighting with the Western armies since 1943. We had promised them that they could participate in the liberation of their own homeland, but we did not let them move into Czechoslovakia until after the Soviet Red Army had taken over. Czechoslovakian and American troops had to ask the Soviets for permission to come into Prague for a victory celebration after the Soviets had been permitted to conquer the country under Eisenhower. As Professor Smoot noted, Western armies under Eisenhower's command rounded up an estimated 5 million anti-communist Russian refugees and delivered them right back to the Soviet Union, who tortured them and then sent them to slave labor camps or murdered them. It was known as Operation Keelhaul. When we pulled our armies out of Eastern Europe in 1945 to let the Soviets have unquestioned control of that area, our top leaders watched silently while the Soviets expelled 9 million Germans from their homes. It was a time of horror, in broad daylight, on the streets and in boxcars by gangs of Soviet soldiers raping, pillaging, and starving old men as they continued to wend their way to conquest. Our top leaders watched while the Soviets liberated Austria, where in Vienna alone, communist soldiers raped more than 100,000 women, many of them girls not yet in their teens. This is the legacy of General Eisenhower. Who made the decision to pull our armies back in Europe and let the Soviets take over? Eisenhower gave the orders, and in his book, Crusade in Europe, which was published in 1948, far before the awful consequences of those decisions were fully known to the public, Eisenhower took his share of credit for making the decisions which led to such enslavement. When he entered politics 4 years later, Eisenhower denied responsibility. He claimed that he was merely a soldier following orders, implementing decisions which Roosevelt and Truman had made. Well, memoirs of British military men indicate that Eisenhower went far beyond the call of military duty in his cooperative efforts to help the Soviets capture political prisoners and enslave all of Central Europe. Triumph in the West by Arthur Bryant, published in 1959, was a history of the war years based on the diaries of Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. And he revealed that in the closing days of World War II, General Eisenhower was often in direct communications with Joe Stalin, reporting his decisions and actions to the Soviet dictator before Eisenhower's own military superiors knew what was going on. General Patton was so angry and so disgusted by what he saw in Eisenhower and the betrayal that took place in Germany and Eastern and Central Europe that he indeed threatened to resign from the U.S. military. Not retire, but resign. And indeed, that was his plan, until a very unfortunate but timely automobile accident managed to kill General Patton. Had Patton returned home alive, he would have brought down General Eisenhower and the entire myth of Roosevelt and World War II. That could not be permitted to happen. To this day, many believe General Patton was assassinated. In the book entitled Roosevelt's Road to Russia, published by Henry Regenary Company, Chicago, 1959, George N. Crocker made the following comments. On September 29, 1941, Yaroslav Molotov vowed allegiance on behalf of the Soviet Union in the 8 points of what was then known as the Atlantic Charter. Less than 2 years before, the Soviet Union had been expelled from the League of Nations for aggression against her little neighbor, Finland. She had, with the Nazis, marched into Poland and wiped it off the map. She had recently overrun the sovereign nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and annexed them. Yet this marauder was now being made a partner of Great Britain and the United States, with FDR in control. Stalin, the strong-armed brigand of Eastern Europe, was about to be christened Uncle Joe and given 1 out of 3 seats at the tables of the mighty. That, of course, would be referring to the conference at Tehran. What was to be done about Poland was a sort of ethical test of the Allies in this war. The British had based their declarations of war on Germany in 1939 upon Hitler's violation of the Polish frontier. The war would degenerate into a monstrous historic fraud if the Allies themselves were to enact a new rape of unhappy Poland. Yet, this is exactly what happened. The new American policy which Roosevelt initiated when he set out to help the Soviet Bolsheviks win the war in Europe, feeling that he could, quote, handle Joe Stalin, was the policy of injecting America into the wars and affairs of all nations for the purpose of creating a one-world society. Because America could no longer live alone, they told us, the policy of perpetual war for perpetual peace, and not Roosevelt's many personal errors in conducting the policy, was the real reason for American involvement in World War II and for the chaos and destruction which followed. As Professor Smoot notes, in October of 1943, Cordell Hull, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Eden, Foreign Minister for Great Britain, and V. Molotov, the Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs, had a conference in Moscow. Eden suggested they create a European Advisory Commission which would decide how Germany, after defeat, would be partitioned, occupied, and governed by 3 victorious powers, including the Soviets. Molotov approved. Hull did not like the idea, but agreed to it in deference to the wishes of the other 2. The very next month, November of 1943, FDR went to Tehran for his first visit with Stalin and Churchill. Aboard the USS Iowa en route to Tehran, Roosevelt had a conference with his Joint Chiefs of Staff. They discussed, among other things, the post-war division and occupation of Germany. Mind you, this is while the war was still waging. But Germany had obviously been on the decline and was beginning to lose the war. President Roosevelt predicted that Germany would collapse suddenly, and there would definitely be a race for Berlin by the great 3 powers. The president said, "We may have to put the United States divisions in Berlin as soon as possible because the United States should have Berlin." Roosevelt's point man, Harry Hopkins, who would later be identified as working for the Communist Party under Soviet control in the Roosevelt administration, he suggested that we be ready to put an airborne division into Berlin 2 hours after the collapse of Germany. Roosevelt wanted the United States to occupy Berlin and northwestern Germany, and wanted the British to occupy France, Belgium, and southern Germany, and then wanted the Soviets to have eastern Germany. All of Roosevelt's military advisors agreed with his proposals. They also agreed that we would have very little trouble with the British. The British would want to occupy the northwestern part of Germany because that was the most heavily industrialized. None of them, Roosevelt, Harry Hopkins, or members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, anticipated any trouble with the Soviet Union over post-war division and occupation of Germany. Well, at the Tehran Conference, November 27th through December 2nd of 1943, Stalin seemed singularly indifferent to the question of which power would occupy which zones of Germany after the war. Stalin revealed intense interest in only three topics. Number one, urging the Western Allies to make a frontal assault across the English Channel on Hitler's fortress Europe. Number two, finding out immediately the name of the man whom the Western Allies would designate to command such an operation. You see, Eisenhower had not yet been selected. And number three, reducing the whole of Europe to virtual impotence so that the Soviet Union would be the only major player on the continent. Talk about treason. Talk about sellout. This was at Tehran in 1943. Roosevelt, of course, eagerly and readily approved of every single proposal that Uncle Joe Stalin made.
America has tested the world's first atomic bomb. From Potsdam, an ultimatum to Japan: unconditional surrender or prompt and utter destruction. Millions of leaflets fall on the island empire. Gathered like propaganda souvenirs, their warning is ignored. Truman acts. The Enola Gay, an American bomber named after the pilot's mother, takes off from a Pacific airstrip on August 6th. The lives of American fighting men are the president's concern, but as years pass, historians will question America's use of the atomic bomb.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
August 9th, an atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. Total casualties in the two attacks, more than 150,000 killed.
How is it possible for the United States to enter yet another world war, ostensibly for the purpose of defeating dictatorship around the world and stopping the Nazis in Europe? And yet, at the very end of that war, to see the betrayal of all of these nations in Europe, and indeed, ultimately, just a few years later, in Asia, with the formation of the communist dictatorship of Mao Zedong, the butcher of Red China. How is it possible that communism would now be given a new life and spread its tentacles throughout the globe?
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many. One communist among the American advisors at Yalta was one communist too many. And even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
And indeed, that was Senator Joseph McCarthy. Senator McCarthy had information revealed to him, actually, from the federal government itself. The FBI had issued a number of investigations, but it was not allowed to pursue those investigations into communist infiltration of the United States government by none other than the Eisenhower administration. On February 9, 1950, Senator McCarthy had made the charge that there were a number of, quote, bright young men in the State Department who had shaped American foreign policy, that we find ourselves in a position of impotency in this final all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. And then Joe McCarthy made the statement which catapulted him from relative obscurity into the national and international spotlight, where he remained until his untimely death in 1957. These were his exact words, quote, "I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who would appear to be either card-carrying members or certain loyalty to the Communist Party, but who nevertheless are still helping to shape our foreign policy." Well, to this day, some people contend that the figures used by McCarthy were indeed fudged. Quite the contrary is true. In fact, the historical record shows that 57 of the cases were later summoned by a loyalty board, and 54 of the accused confirmed McCarthy's charges by resigning under fire. By November of 1954, all of the 81 persons on McCarthy's list had left government employment by dismissal or resignation. And then the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee had revealed that on June 27, 1956, the State Department's own security chief, Scott McLeod, drew up a list of 847 security risks in the State Department. Senator McCarthy's committee investigations reached into the United States Army, where it was felt that there had been significant communist penetration during that time. Well, he was met with a stone of silence, indeed, outright opposition to his investigations. Secretary of the Army was Secretary Stevens, but it wasn't Stevens who put up the most resistance to uncovering communist agents within the United States Army. It was none other than Brigadier General Ralph W. Zwicker. General Zwicker was arrogant, and he detested the idea that the Congress of the United States would begin investigating alleged communist infiltration in the United States Army. McCarthy didn't quite see it that way.
I shall never accede to the abuse of Army personnel under any circumstances, including committee hearings. I will never accede to them being browbeaten or humiliated.
If a stupid, arrogant, or witless man in a position of power appears before our committee and is found aiding the Communist Party, he will be exposed. The fact that he might be a general places him in no special class as far as I am concerned.
The effective work of Senator McCarthy and his committee began to ripple with opposition in the United States, particularly the media, the Washington Post, the New York Times, again, the same New York Times that had sent a reporter to the Soviet Union in the 1920s, Walter Duranty, to cozy up to Joseph Stalin and essentially close his eyes to genocide, was now leading the charge against, quote, McCarthyism. What was the effect of all of this? Was Joe McCarthy right? Or was he engaged in a witch hunt of immense proportions? Well, here are the facts. The fact is, the targets of those official investigations were not engaged in harmless dissent. They actively promoted the interests of a murderous, aggressive foreign power. In 1995, the National Security Agency declassified the records of telegraphic communications between Moscow and its intelligence assets in the United States. Those intercepted communications, known as the Venona documents, prove irrefutably that the Soviet intelligence network included such top government officials as Algier Hiss, Harry Dexter White, and Harry Hopkins, as well as nuclear scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, and then the atomic spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Well, the Venona intercepts, as they have come to be known, also documented in damning detail that the United States Communist Party was a wholly owned and controlled subsidiary of the Kremlin. Indeed, as Robert Romerstein, a one-time investigator for the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and the late Eric Brindell note in their study, The Venona Secrets, Quote, "The communists did not represent just another political party. Their loyalty was to a foreign power, the Soviet Union, and their goal was nothing less than the subversion and destruction of American constitutional government. To advance that goal, the leadership of the Communist Party conscripted wherever and whichever of its members were capable of espionage to assist the Soviet intelligence service," unquote. These recruitment efforts focused heavily on key people in the Roosevelt New Deal administration. Indeed, Harry Hopkins was Roosevelt's chief advisor and confidant. He, too, was exposed as an operative on behalf of the Soviet Union. Well, obviously, Senator McCarthy at that time knew exactly what he was doing. He realized the nature of the forces that he was dealing with. But that didn't stop certain people from waging a war, not against communists and communist infiltration of the United States government with its deadly consequences in American foreign policy, but against the senator himself. The heavy guns were brought out. CBS, Fred Friendly, and of course Edward R. Murrow were to lead the charge against Senator McCarthy right up to the very end, charging that McCarthy had been reckless and that he had been going overboard in his attempts to deal with communist Soviet spies in government. Can you imagine? With the Iron Curtain erected, slavery, genocide, and terror all throughout Europe, and now, thanks to men like the Roosevelt administration's General George Marshall, who was Secretary of State under Harry Truman, Red China would also be part of that empire of slavery. So McCarthy had to be destroyed. Well, in November of 1954, the Senate actually voted to censure McCarthy.
Do you think this will ruin your political career?
No. I don't think the American people are at all fooled. They know that I'm being censured because I dared to expose communism, treason in government.
Senator, do you feel that you have not been censured in this action?
I wouldn't say that today was a vote of confidence.
The conclusion obviously shows that America's foreign policy had been hijacked by the Soviet Union from the Roosevelt administration beginning in 1933 with its official recognition of the bankrupt and corrupt dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. Because of Mr. Roosevelt's ideological kinship with the communists and his boast that some of his best friends were communists, the United States government became embarked on a Soviet plan to conquer Eastern Europe, and that it did with the advancement of World War II. Pearl Harbor was the key, and General Marshall was not yet Secretary of State under Truman, yet he was one of the instrumental men who would be responsible for the Pearl Harbor debacle, which could have been prevented, but again, had it been prevented, it also would have prevented America's entry into World War II on the side of Uncle Joe Stalin, as he was called. What are our conclusions in this documentary? I'll let Dan Smoot, who we referred to throughout this whole program, and to whom this program, this documentary, has been dedicated. Professor Smoot said, although internationalists admit the collapse of their own policy of world meddling and have shown themselves intellectually incapable of creating any policy different from the one already collapsed, they react with scorn when anyone suggests returning to the traditional American foreign policy, the policy enunciated by George Washington, that of national independence, not interdependence. They call it isolationism. That was the policy that actually was in existence for a total of 148 years, from 1789 to 1917, and from 1920 to 1940. Let's look into this. What shape would we and the rest of the world be in today if George Washington's policy of national independence or political, quote, isolationism, for those who prefer the phrase, had never been abandoned? If isolationists have had their way about keeping us out of World War I, we would have saved hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded American soldiers. We would have been spared the waste of natural resources and the Great Depression we suffered in the backwash of World War I. We would also have been spared the New Deal socialist revolution, which was fobbed off on the American people as a means of ending the Depression. We would have been 1,000 times better off if we had stayed out of World War I. And so would the Europeans whom we joined in the war. The war in Europe would have ground to some sort of stalemate peace, as wars in Europe have been doing for 2,000 years, and there probably would not have been any World War II. By throwing her great strength into the European war, America destroyed ancient balances of power, prolonged the war, and made it more savage. Without American help, European governments could not afford the prolonged total wars which have become the fashion of the 20th century. Professor Smoot concludes, if the isolationists had had their way and kept us out of World War II, Hitler and Stalin would have destroyed each other, and the evil systems they controlled might have died with them. And there would have been no Korean War, which cost another 53,000 casualties and ended in disgrace for the American people and the United States. If isolationists had had their way, the United States would not today be so entangled in the affairs of all nations that every border conflict threatens to become another American war. Professor Smoot concludes, finally, the traditional policy of political isolationism made it possible for America to become a powerful citadel of freedom, a beacon of hope for all men everywhere. That was a legacy long abandoned, much to our disgrace. Ladies and gentlemen, the cost of allowing the United States to become a footstool for the Council on Foreign Relations that we referred to at the beginning of this program, that guided Woodrow Wilson after World War I to a policy of abandonment of nationalism and independence in favor of interdependence, was continued over and over again at a cost of literally hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, profit for bankers and loss for the American public as well as the world. The boogeyman of Nazism was long gone when we were beginning to chase the boogeyman of communism. Communism was created by our involvement in World War II, sustained and spread by that same support system that General Eisenhower employed during the war, and later Harry Truman. So now we know the real story of America's truthful involvement in World War II. That's right. World War II, the untold story, America's legacy of betrayal.